The story of the 300 Spartans has seen its fair share of mainstream exposure, mostly thanks to the Zack Snyder film. That film, however, is quite historically inaccurate, for better or worse. Take the clothes. Do you really think someone wore that to battle? Everything from how the Greeks fought to the Persian military is misrepresented. To understand their stand at Thermopylae, we first need to understand who the Spartans were and why were they fighting the Persians. Chapter 1. Origins. The Spartans were Dorian Greeks who migrated to Laconia, an administrative region in Greece, sometime around the 9th century BCE. On the banks of Eurotas River in the Eurotas Valley was the main city-state of this area, Lacedaemon. The main settlement of this city-state was called Sparta. However, the residents were called Lacedaemonians, all the same. They were rarely explicitly referred to as Spartans. Herodotus and Thucydides tell us that they experienced social turmoil and unrest during the 8th and 7th centuries, leading to some major reforms. One of the major tenets of these reforms was the agoge, a rigorous state program for training skilled warriors. From age 7, boys underwent intense physical and mental training to prepare them for the worst. If the state had enough of these able-bodied and well-trained men at its disposal, no one would dare think of revolts and civil wars. So they decided on a system to make permanent use of these men, a standing army. By the end of the 7th century BCE, the Lacedaemonians were emerging as one of the most vicious people in the entire Hellenistic world. Before this, and for quite some after, Greek city-states rarely employed standing armies. But after all those years of training, Spartans were literally built different. Chapter 2. The Persians arrive in force. The Persians decided to invade Greece in 492 BCE after some Ionian city-states revolted against Persian subjugation. Athens, among others, had helped these city-states carry out these revolts. Darius the Great of the Achaemenid Empire was not thrilled, to say the least. He sent envoys to call for the submission of the entire Greece. These envoys were executed. So, with 28,000 men and more than 600 vessels, he set out to conquer the entirety of Greece. But the first blow arrived in the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, when an outnumbered Greek force sent the invaders packing. Once Darius passed away, his son Xerxes I began his invasion with close to 1,000 vessels and anywhere between 120,000 and 300,000 men. Considering the sheer scale of this war effort, the Greek city-states had to put their differences aside and come together. But it was far too late. A force as big as Xerxes could be standing on their doorstep in a few weeks, and they needed time. They initially decided to make a stand near the borders of Thessaly, but soon realized the fallibility of the plan after learning of the size of the Persian army. They needed someplace closed off and restrictive, where the Persians would lose their numbers advantage, even if only temporarily. And there was no better place for this than Thermopylae in southern Greece. There was a pass here that arrived through Locris and into Boeotia, which could hold the invaders back for a few days. Chapter 3. Spartan Culture and Military Regimen. The film gives the idea that heightened eroticism and outrageous sexual encounters bred strong men in the region. This is, of course, completely false. The Spartans had clearly defined social classes. The Spartiates or homoios were the elites who were highly competent in all sorts of warfare. These were the citizens of the state and were meant to protect the entire civilization from exterior and interior threats. To foster communal spirit among the soldiers, Spartans used to dine together in syssitia or messes. Then there were people from surrounding settlements who were brought into the fold, the perioikoi, or those who live around us. These were free non-citizens with functional social roles who contributed to the economy in good times and served alongside the elites in troubled times. Since they were not qualified as citizens, they did not enjoy any of the political rights of the Spartiates. And finally, the Lacedaemon society had helots. These were mostly state-owned serfs who provided agricultural labor. Given how the elites probably had no pain, no gain painted over the walls of their dojos, they treated the helots miserably. The helots, while abused and mistreated to no end, ran the wheels of the economy, considering everyone else was busy figuring out how to stab people to death. So you have one group of people who know how to stab people to death and another that doesn't. Which group makes the rules around here, do you think? However, there are multiple instances of helot revolts. The Messenian Wars, for instance, were great target practice for the military as they tamed their rebellious slaves. This hierarchical society was led by not one but two kings to offer checks and balances, which brought political stability to a region filled with lots of testosterone. The overabundance of testosterone was an issue for other Greek city-states as well. The Spartans were expansionists and were involved in several spats with their neighbors. The Argives and the Boeotians, in particular, were sick to death. And when I say death, I mean it. But before the Spartans could throw a wrench in everybody's plans in the form of the Peloponnesian Wars, they were interrupted by the Persians. And who was chosen to defend the pass at Thermopylae? One of the Spartan kings, Leonidas, who, if stories are to be believed, descended from Hercules. Chapter 4. The Stand at Thermopylae. A joint army of around 7,000 men, not 300, arrived in the pass at Thermopylae. The army was composed of around 2,120 Arcadians, 1,000 Locrians, 1,000 Phocians, 700 Thespians, 400 Corinthians, 400 Thebans, 200 Phliasians, and 80 Mycenaeans. Leonidas was leading these men into battle. He arrived with 1,200 men, 300 Spartans, and a few hundred helots. Various reasons are given for committing so few troops to the front line. Herodotus, for instance, says that the Olympic Games were underway along with the Spartan festival of Carneia. Both forbade violence. The defenders were low on men, but they had the advantageous terrain. The Thermopylae Pass had steep mountains that ran down into the sea. Speaking of the sea, 300 Greek warships were deployed to prevent Persians from sailing inland across Locris and Boeotia. That meant that the pass was the only pragmatic way into Greece, for the time being at least. Here, the local Phocians had built a defensive wall right up to the sea. Upon arrival, the Spartans made some necessary repairs to it and decided to position themselves in a 15-meter-wide gap. On one side was the sea, on the other, a cliff. Short of an exceptional maneuver, their flanks were protected. The Persians arrived slowly, thanks to bad weather and lagging troops. Xerxes waited 5 days before his assault, mostly because he believed that the defenders soiled their pants upon hearing about his massive army and that he'd have an empty pass pretty soon. When this did not come to pass, pun intended, he sent an envoy to ask for surrender and avoid bloodshed. Leonidas replied something to the tune of, "Come and get us." The Greeks were arrogant because of their fighting style. Their heavily armored hoplites were some of the best infantry units in the entire world. To hold their ground, they would form a phalanx with long weapons. The phalanx was incredibly efficient in defensive forms, restricting the enemy's ability to move into range. I mean, just look at it. How do you even get past that? Since the formation was highly effective for defending tight locations, this was their time to shine. The Persians, on the other hand, relied on their archers to cut down the enemy, while the cavalry ran down to rerouting and retreating troops. Both advantages were lost here, because their light arrows could not penetrate the bronze armor of the Greek hoplites, and the cavalry had no room for flanking. On the first day of engagement, the Median and Kissian troops arrived to test the Greek infantry. They were quickly told in no uncertain terms, "You shalt not pass." Xerxes then sent his revered immortals into the fray, who gave the defenders a tough time, but could not force a breakthrough. While the Greeks held firm the second day, the tide had shifted. A local shepherd called Ephialtes showed Xerxes' men an alternative route in hopes of a reward. The Anapaia path, as it was known, would allow the Persians to sneak past the front line and attack them from the southern flank. Leonidas had stationed Phocian troops to guard this point. Since Leonidas was informed of the local shepherd's betrayal, he realized the severity of the situation. The Phocians had to hold. But as the immortals arrived, they withdrew, assuming a higher defensive position and letting the enemy a free path to Leonidas' men. The Spartan king knew that his position was exposed, so he had to make a tough decision. He ordered most of his men to retreat before they were inevitably cut off. Leonidas stood his ground with 300 Spartan, 400 Theban, and 700 Thespian hoplites with around 900 helots. This was their last stand. The enemy would charge from the front and the back, leaving them no option but to become martyrs for their land. They knew they had to fight to the death. Xerxes finally had the Spartans right where he wanted them. His immortals arriving from behind would shatter the Greek legions quickly, but they were a tad late. They had finally run into the Phocians stationed there. Some historians believe that the Phocians surrendered. Others believe that they might have been killed. Leonidas knew that the immortals were a bit behind schedule. When the fighting restarted in the morning, he committed all his men forward, leaving the rear exposed. The weapons clanking violently against the armor, the fierce whistle of Persian arrows, and the sound of thousands of footsteps shuffling for their life. Both armies were undeterred. The Spartan king went into battle as always, leading by example before falling prey to the Persian might. By this time, the spears of most of them were broken, and they were slaying the Persians with their swords. There in that travail fell Leonidas, fighting most gallantly, and with him other famous Spartans. All 300. His troops tried their best to recover his body, to no avail. They were barely managing the front when the immortals started arriving from the rear. Barrage after barrage of Persian missile fire had already thinned their ranks, and the charging immortals finished the job. The Greeks had fallen. Xerxes ordered Leonidas' head to be put on a stake for all to see. Chapter 5. Aftermath. The oracle at Delphi had ordained that either Sparta or one of her kings would fall. Leonidas had fallen. Leonidas and his men turned into an emblem of patriotism, courage, and martyrdom. His cult survived for a few centuries. The war at sea was rather inconclusive. The weather delayed the Persian advance as they lost more than 400 vessels in a storm. When they finally engaged the Greeks, they could not hold them in place. News of Leonidas's death was making rounds, so the Greeks decided to withdraw. After years of back and forth, the war ended with the battles of Plateau and Mycale, in 479 BCE. By the time the Persians went back home, the Greeks were at each other's throats. The Peloponnesian War was well underway, with the Lacedaemonians leading the Peloponnesian League against the Athens-led Ionian League. But that's a discussion for another time. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. See you in the next one.